In the last lesson, we talked a lot about how we should not be using the funnel framework to guide our acquisition strategy. Instead, we should be thinking about our strategy as a system of compounding loops. That is how the fastest and most meaningful companies grow. Because a loop answers that one really simple question. How does one cohort of users lead to another cohort of users? In other words, it has this self-reinvesting system, helps act like compound interest and creating that compounding growth over time, helping us escape from that linear growth and kind of reaching new ceilings. Now, when we think about loops, there are four primary categories of acquisition loops that we'll be going through in a lot of detail within this module. The first category of acquisition loops are viral loops. So the basic generic viral loop is somebody signs up, a certain percentage of them invite friends, a certain percentage of them click on those invites, creating new signups, repeating the steps of the loop. We can think about a couple quick examples. Slack. A new user signs up, a certain percentage of them create a team, they invite team members, a certain percentage of them click on invites, creating more users, repeating the steps of the loop. We can also think about the B2B product Drift. They create sales and marketing chatbots. So a new user signs up, a certain percentage of them create a chatbot, and then a certain percentage of them embed that chatbot on their sites. And then as people visit their customer site and see the Drift branding on the chatbot, a certain percentage of them click on that, becoming new users, repeating the steps of the loop. The second category of acquisition loops are content loops. Now, there's a couple different variations of content loops that we'll be going through. The first is a user-generated content loop. So a user signs up for our product, a certain percentage of them create content. Google indexes that content, people find that content in the search engine, and then a certain percentage of them sign up for the product, repeating the steps of the loop. Yelp is a perfect example of this, where a new user signs up, a certain percent of them leave reviews and they create content. Google indexes that content, people find that content as they look for different restaurants and businesses and reviews, which leads to more signups, repeating the steps of the loop. The second type of a content loop is a company-generated content loop. So the company gets a new lead, follower, or customer. Then they generate more content. That content is then distributed and amplified by that following base, creating more visitors, which a certain percentage convert into leads, followers, and customers, repeating the steps of the loop. HubSpot kind of wrote the book on this loop. They had a bunch of new leads or followers. They created content. They distributed that content to that following base, generate a bunch more visitors, creating more leads and followers over time. The third category of loops are paid loops. So a paid marketing loop where a new user signs up, a certain percentage of them convert to a paid product. That revenue is then reinvested to buy more ads. A certain percentage of them act on the ad, creating more signups, repeating the steps of the loop. A bunch of mobile games like Clash of Clans have used this loop to a very high degree. So a new user signs up on Clash of Clans, a certain percentage of them pay for premium items. That revenue is reinvested to buy more ads, a certain percentage act on the ad, creating more users and repeating the steps of the loop. The fourth category of acquisition loops we'll go through are sales loops. So the core of a sales loop is that as new users, customers are signed on, that revenue is reinvested to add more reps to the sales space. Those reps then work the leads and create more customers over time. Now, the key about the sales loop is that it's always combined with a second type of loop, a lead loop. So in this example, in the HubSpot examples, on the left-hand side, we have the content-generated company loop that's generating leads, and then we have the sales loop on the right that is converting those leads into customers. We can always think about a sales loop almost like a marketplace. We're kind of managing that liquidity between the leads and how efficient a rep is. We'll go through how the different sales loops are defined by the different types of lead loops and the different advantages and disadvantages of each type. So these are the four different categories of loops: viral loops, content loops, paid loops, and sales loops. Now, the key here is that many of the fastest growing companies layer on multiple loops over time. So we can go through a couple different examples. We can think about LinkedIn, who's been a master of layering on different types of loops over time. The core of their company started with the viral loop around building your network. So users would sign on, invite other users because the product became more valuable as more of their contact base was on the product. They then layered on a user-generated content loop, whereas users filled out profiles, they got those profiles indexed and ranked in Google, which generated more users. Over time, they then layered on sales loops to sell different B2B products like Sales Navigator or their recruiting product, which layered on a new layer of growth. Then they recently layered on another user-generated content loop with the publishing business. So as users created content on the LinkedIn platform, that content either gets shared out to social channels or ranked in SEO, which creates more users for LinkedIn. Now, it's not just LinkedIn, but we can also think about Airbnb as somebody who has layered on multiple acquisition loops over time. So their business started off by an incentivized viral loop. So as users and customers kind of came on, they could invite other users and they would get money and give money as an incentive in order to attract more users to the platform. They then layered on a user-generated content loop where the host landing pages would get ranked in Google. So as you would search in Google, you would find Airbnb listings and potentially become a user. They then layered on paid marketing loops, and finally other types of viral loops like a trip invite loop where you can invite users in your trip planning process, bringing them onto the platform. Now, even though that the top companies are ones that layer on loops over time, we want to make sure that you know an important point. Depending on where you're at as a company, more loops do not equal a better strategy. It's very tempting for people to basically draw out a map of just an infinite number of loops thinking that they have an amazing strategy. But every loop has a cost and return. And so it's almost better to have 1 to 2 incredibly high returning loops. That's better than having a bunch of low returning loops where we're going to incur a bunch of costs and spread our team across a bunch of different areas. So the key here, once again, is that this cost and return means that all loops are not created equally. Just because we can draw a loop does not mean it's impactful or powerful for our business. So we need to understand how we measure the strength of loops. And that's what we're going to go through in the next lesson.